ideas change who we are in a very fundamental sense. I'm concerned about unthinking acceptance of convenient short-term solutions. You could argue, right, interestingly enough, that our lives online is like a brain scan of 1 billion people.
So earlier today, David, in conversations here at the Institute, you made a provocative comment, and I'd like to challenge you to unpack it for us. You said that when Leibniz and Newton introduced to the world the calculus, it gave us a new way to look at the world, new tool set. You made the statement that we emerged a different species. But what do you mean by that? And you're an evolutionary biologist, scientist, so geneticist, so I mean, you've got to really stand behind a comment like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what makes us a unique species, we typically look at our genome. We look at the genes we have that other species don't have, and how those contribute to our fitness, to our adaptiveness. But you can make the same claim for ideas. You can say, what ideas do we have that have contributed to our fitness, cultural fitness? And I think over the course of history, creative teams and creative individuals have come up with ideas that have fundamentally changed our ability to interact with the physical world. And the calculus is one such candidate concept. And so I'm being somewhat facetious when I say new species, but at the same time I'm meaning it, because ideas change who we are in a very fundamental sense. They change how we obtain energy in the world, they change how we organize our societies, they change how we move. And so in some sense they're as important, if not more important, than genes.
What do you mean they change how we move? What does that exactly mean?
Well, think about the calculus. Without the calculus, we wouldn't have rocket ships, right? We wouldn't have aircraft.
Right.
We wouldn't have boats. So in some sense, the effect of this idea is greater than the effect of many genes, and we understand that. And yet we don't have a vocabulary for discussing what they did to our evolutionary history, what's happened to our lineage, the hominid lineage, as a consequence of the discovery or invention of the calculus. So I was being facetious, but I was trying to make a serious point at the same time. If you think about the universe of electrons and planets and stars, they don't learn from their experiences. They don't have a sense of purpose. But if you look at an ant or a virus or a human being, we behave for a reason. We have an objective in mind. And when we fail, we learn, we revise our strategy, and we do it again differently. And the mathematics that have been developed historically to deal with the non-living world can't deal effectively with learning agents. And so,
because they're very deterministic, or they're very too specific to
determinism
particular
is
application?
Deterministic would be one. Invariant, they don't change. The rules governing their behavior are written in stone, right? Whereas with the systems we study, they're self-referential. They're inspecting themselves and they're saying, could I do it better?
They evolve
could I
over
do
time.
it differently? They evolve.
Right.
And that requires a very different approach, both mathematically and computationally. And that different approach, applied across a wide range of phenomena, from cells to societies, is what we mean when we say complexity science.
I see. So the notion of applying that kind of a methodology, a perspective, to a human system or a living system, as opposed to, say, the laws of physics.
Correct.
Which, at least so far, we believe don't change very much.
Exactly.
Right. We're interested in, over the next few generations, given all the technologies that are finally becoming prime time, whether that's artificial intelligence or genetic engineering, cybernetics, these technologies will change how we are physically, the capabilities we have mentally, perhaps it changes us emotionally. From your perspective, how might being human change over the next few generations? And as well, how might it not change?
You know, you have to set that question in a broader historical context.
Great.
Our tendency is always to view our own time as unique and special and different. And of course, in many ways it is. But to really get at that question in a rigorous way, as we would here at SFI, you should go back about 150,000 years ago to the Paleolithic and ask, what happened then? What changed then, the origin of modern humans? And then trace that forward into the present. And I have done that, and many of my colleagues have. And you have to think about how revolutionary the first stone tool was, right? You have to think about how revolutionary the first inscribed stone tablet was, right? How revolutionary the first library was. And so...
Do you think, David, that the first person who chipped out a stone tool
Yeah.
actually realized how significant that was? Or was it just, this cuts this thing better?
I think they looked at it and they thought, oh my Lord, and hid it from all of their friends
They
and
couldn't
family.
file a patent.
They couldn't
so
file a patent, and I think they realized very quickly how extraordinary it was. And the question then is there a sense in which our time is different? And I think what most people would say about our time is very large populations, highly connected, leading to a very rapid pace of change. And so if you were to look at, the year 2000 BC and the year 1000 BC, there would be some differences, but by and large...
Not dramatic.
Not dramatic.
Right.
And that's 1,000 years. But if you looked at the year 1800 and then looked at the year 2016, which is about 200 years, they would look almost unrecognizably different. And I think, so it's not necessarily that we're living in a technological age versus a non-technological age, but this notion of time and the speed at which things are happening does feel somewhat different.
So what might not change about being human, or maybe we should say the experience of being human? What might not change, do you think, over the remainder of this century?
I mean, I think that it's an interesting question, and one way to get at that is by looking at comparative data across the globe with many different societies. They have different technologies and different languages. Of course, there are extraordinary commonalities. And yet, we travel a lot, both of us, and, you're always amazed by how similar we all are in terms of decency, fairness, aspirations, reciprocity, creativity.
Right.
These seem to be invariants. And I think if you went back 2,000 years to, or 3,000 years to ancient Sumer, you would meet that. You'd meet someone, you'd say, this is a decent human being. This is a human being with aspirations and creativity. It seems to be invariant. I think the timescales over which those core human values change is very slow. It's the paraphernalia of culture, the connective tissue of individuals, in part, provided by technology. That's changing very fast. But I don't think we're changing very fast in some ways. And I think this is the debate. I mean, what are those things that we can count on into the future to steer a responsible course? And what are those things that we think really will no longer be here, that we have to worry about?
So I want to come back to that question of steering a responsible course. But before we do, you made a comment earlier today that I found very interesting, and that was, with the invention of arithmetic, we acquired a new ethics.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Everyone is familiar with the moral, ethical implications of the atomic bomb. It's a weapon, and we make a decision.
And developed not too far from here, in fact.
And we're here in part because of the Manhattan Project. But what went into that? Well, mathematics, and at its base, arithmetic. Structures of knowledge always have ethical implications. If you think about online banking, or banking in the old-fashioned style with pen and paper, decisions were being made about you based on metrics, your savings, your assets, your responsible investment history. These were calculated out, and on the basis of that result, a decision was made that was in some dimensions a moral decision. And so the idea that somehow you can separate technology, mathematics, reason from morality strikes me as extraordinarily naive.
So reflecting on, for instance, the earliest days of writing and arithmetic in ancient Sumerians, Hammurabi's code, and they started to grapple with trying to figure out the quantitative value of different people within society.
Yeah.
And this is all aside from equality. That was a concept that didn't exist for thousands of years. But coming up with a quantitative value, an arithmetic value for individuals in various conflicts in society seems to bear that out. So that arithmetic impact on ethics seems likely to have an analog today with artificial intelligence and the ethics we will be embedding, whether we know it or not, into things like artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. So let's come back to this topic now about where things might be going in the future. What are some of the ethical quandaries that you see on our horizon that we should be considering?
I think what everyone is concerned about now is really fundamental issues of free will, privacy, dignity, and control. Who is controlling whom? And do we even know? Are our decisions our own, or are they mediated and controlled by algorithms? Is our biology our own, or through means of genetic engineering will we be changing that too? And so these are the public debates now around science, and they're important to have. And so if you asked me what I'm most concerned about, I'm concerned about unthinking acceptance of convenient short-term solutions to problems.
Unthinking acceptance of convenient short-term solutions.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, look, I mean, we all know that there's a trade-off between the short-term and the long-term, right? It happens, for example, with antibiotics. You get infected, it's in your best short-term interest to devour those antibiotics, even if you are not infected with the appropriate microbe. And as a consequence of that, increase the odds of generating a resistant strain that goes on to infect your family, your friends, society, and perhaps even yourself in the future. And that's a beautiful example of just thinking about the short term and in your selfish interests. The same is true, I think, for technology. There are things we'll readily accept. Yes, you can have all of my information, right? Yes, you can make decisions for me about how I should invest my monies, or where I should go on vacation, or what book I should read.
But possibly some of those solutions, probably some of those solutions will end up being more effective or certainly efficient, but more effective even than we are as human beings making some of those decisions.
That's absolutely true, but it's that deliberative process, a sort of a sifting and winnowing of the possibilities, experimentation, understanding that we have to be always aware that the decisions we made might have been imperfect and be willing to change. And if you outsource those decisions, then it's not really within your power to change them easily. And so what I worry about almost more than anything else is a certain kind of mental laziness and an unwillingness to engage with the difficult issues. And that's so pervasive, and it probably always has been, by the way, but it's somehow more pressing in a time where there are systems out there willing to make the decisions for you.
So you therefore call for a greater sense of personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
That people, human beings, need to step up and spend the time to learn and understand from their own perspective what these things mean.
Absolutely.
So they can make reasonable decisions. We see this all the time right now, especially in our society. What recently seems to have been a rise in anti-science and anti-expert, a lack of trust in institutions across the board, worldwide.
But you know, a lack of trust is a healthy thing.
If it's a healthy skepticism.
If it's a healthy skepticism, if you're willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to take what you say at face value.
Right.
I'm going to do some research and determine what you said is, if what you said is true. And I think that is foundational to the scientific enterprise. You know, and I think that's different from a sort of carte blanche I won't listen to anything you say. But I would love to live in a society where every remark was questioned and people did their due diligence and went away.
Sounds a lot like the Santa Fe Institute.
It sounds like the Santa Fe Institute. We should question everything.
Yeah. But let's go to the other extremes. So on one extreme, we have the unengaged
Yeah.
individual, and that's dangerous for them and frankly for society in general.
Yeah.
But on the other end of the spectrum, we can also end up with perhaps too much engagement or unthinking engagement. For instance, moratoriums.
Yeah.
There are people who believe understandably, because some of these technologies are so fundamental in the capabilities they create, the changes they wrought, maybe even biologically for us, such as genetic engineering, that we might need some moratoriums or some breaks on some of these developments. What are your thoughts about that perspective?
Yeah, I think this is an extraordinarily interesting and complex problem, and it's a reason why we should be thinking about them here at the Santa Fe Institute. My first reaction is I tend to be against blanket bans. I don't like the idea of a moratorium. And because it, in some sense, shifts the focus of power. Because we're not able to engage with the discussion, because the discussion has been turned off.
I see.
And it not always...
If it's been effectively turned off, because the other issue, of course, is it's nice to create a moratorium, but if you can't enforce it worldwide, then what good is it really?
Right, exactly. And so I think that, you know, the history of culture is a history of attempts to suppress heretical dialogue. And what is a heresy? Well, it's all contextual. It's challenging the dominant orthodoxy. That is science, right?
Or should be science.
Well, it should be. I mean, Feynman defined science as a belief in the ignorance of experts. That is science. And I think in some sense, this idea that we won't engage with the problem, to be honest, in the case of things like CRISPR, that is not at all what was intended.
Can you explain for everyone what CRISPR is?
So this is essentially the appropriation of a genetic mechanism found in microbes in order to more effectively do genetic engineering, what would now be called biomimicry.
Very targeted.
Very targeted.
Relatively inexpensive, relatively simple to do, to make genetic changes to the genetic code of an organism.
That's correct. And of course this happens already because we borrowed it from organisms that did just that, microbes. And of course we're concerned rightly about the abuse of this extraordinary genetic power. And the question for society is how to grapple with it. And I don't think that the moratorium is shutting down the debate in this case. I think quite the opposite. But turning away from a problem is not a good idea. I think we have to sort of face the darkness directly and illuminate it. And I think that how best to do that is complex.
So, David, one of the things that is fundamental to Santa Fe Institute's work in complex adaptive systems, of course, are the network relationships between actors of some sort. They could be humans, it could be artificial intelligence, it could be, for that matter, animals or traffic lights.
Yes.
But how do we need to change our approach to thinking about and studying these adaptive connected systems?
Yeah, I think we need a new vocabulary for collectives. If you think about human history, the history in art, in literature, in philosophy, and even in science, it's been very focused on the individual. You know, we have the unconscious and the ego, we have the id. And this has been immensely powerful. But we are a social species, and much of what we think and reason about is derived from our sociality. And because we haven't had the instruments to study the collective until very recently, we've avoided making rigorous inquiries, or largely avoided, in that area to the extent that we want to derive entirely new concepts for the social phase of our existence. So we have fMRI machines, brain scan machines. How do you brain scan 1 million people? Right? And that will inevitably lead to new theories new concepts, and potentially revolutions in our social and political institutions.
Actually, beyond that, how do you brain scan 1 million people? Should you brain scan 1 million people? Under what conditions?
Yes.
How do you study the data that you're seeing?
Absolutely.
How do you do so? What impact are you having on the people who are being studied as a result?
I mean,
all these things are open.
But you could argue, right, interestingly enough, that our lives online is like a brain scan of 1 billion people. The traces we leave in our decisions and choices and purchases and friending and emails is a kind of fossil imprint of our brain that can be studied. So in some sense, we are doing it now.
And
the
it's
questions
already
you
in
ask,
manageable data form that can be very quickly assessed and collected and cleansed and analyzed.
Absolutely, and it's raising exactly the issues. Should we be brain scanning 1 million people? Well,
We already are.
We already are brain scanning 1 billion people.
You know,
Yeah.
I had a similar thought, the other side of that coin.
Yeah.
Just a couple weeks ago, I was reading a biography of William James, and James wrote a lot of letters. In the late 19th century, for that sort of class, it was typical to write a lot of letters, but he was a master at it. And so a lot of the depth of this biography came from reviewing his personal correspondence. I reflected on our personal correspondence in this society, and it's quite limited now. It's usually short shot emails, heaven forbid postings on Facebook, tweets, and there are a lot of data there, and we can analyze it more quickly. But comparing that to this elegant, beautiful, well considered personal letter, explaining my motivations, saying to this individual something, are we losing that as a society?
You know, it's a very interesting question, and to some extent, we clearly are. I think you're right. I think that we only have limited time, and so you can either write several thousand letters in your life that are considered and lengthy and contemplative, or you can write hundreds of thousands of emails that are not. And so there's just a finite limit which imposes a constraint, which means now many people are still writing beautiful letters. And you ask a really interesting question, which is how do we excavate the future past of humanity when the materials we have are in this new form? The good news is that we are still extraordinarily creative in art and science, and so there are beautiful novels being written still,
Absolutely.
and beautiful pieces of music being written. And so it might be that the letter ceases to be as useful, but these other art forms grow in prominence.
So your comments about brain scans for 1 million people, I'm sure that can be turned into lots of nefarious tweets, but let's extrapolate that out into the notion of transparency. So a lot of these technologies allow us to see further and further into the minds and motivations of individual humans, not just a generic society, a primetime television, but each specific individual. There'll be a lot of ethical issues that we face in that respect. And as that transparency becomes more intense and a deeper, perhaps even invasive into our thoughts, our dreams, our emotions, what do you see there? Is there a responsibility of science or business? And if so, what might that be?
It's an interesting issue, and it's my wife, in fact, Jessica Flack, who is a professor here, has made a very interesting remark, and that is that a long time ago, thousands of years ago, when we lived in small groups, we had no privacy. Everyone knew what you were doing, right? They saw the fruits of your labor and so on. And so then there was this phase of population growth without access to the technologies of communication and connectivity. And in that tiny fleeting window of time, we experienced privacy.
Interesting. So privacy, in some ways, is has been more of a result of our lack of deep connection with small groups.
Right. And so now we're returning to a mutant version of that ancient state, and it's mutant because now that lack of anonymity is being experienced with tens of thousands of individuals, if not more. And so it might not be, the debate might not be about privacy and anonymity so much as the scale of knowledge.
And it's one thing if your neighbor or your cousin knows all these intimate details. It's another thing if Google knows it or the government organization
and
knows
that's,
it.
by the way, something that humans, by virtue of their cultural conditioning, are very ill-equipped to deal with.
Which is what?
Which is the following, which is, I find it irksome if my neighbor knows my habits, how much I'm spending on gasoline every week. But it doesn't seem to bother me if Google knows. And so we don't have the right immune system for dealing with who has access to our knowledge, because we're so conditioned on the local version. And I think we're probably into the future going to have to develop a way of dealing and reasoning through the lack of privacy at scale. We know how to deal with it at the level of individuals, right? We lock our doors, you'll hide things in certain parts of your house, or you have your letters sealed. Those kinds of procedures and habits haven't generalized very effectively to the online world.
So we're not intellectually, emotionally, or culturally prepared for mass interconnected communities.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Interesting. So that's something that we'll see happen over the next few generations because it has to. Planets and stars don't learn or have a sense of purpose. Pushing the boundaries, free will, privacy, dignity, control, trust, understanding the individual, understanding the collective, and the collectives are fundamentally changing in the coming generations. We must face the darkness, and we're glad that we have people like you holding a lantern. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.